There's some pretty alarming polling in the Sunday Times if you're a unionist today. Surge of support for independence in Scotland as well as Ireland and even some growth in Wales. In your view this morning, how much of a danger is the union in right now?
Well, I don't underestimate the challenge we're facing. When I became leader of the Scottish Conservatives last summer, I knew that we had a big fight on our hands to ensure Scotland remains a strong part of the United Kingdom. But I also don't believe it's inevitable, one, that the SNP will get a majority at the elections this year, and two, that there will be another independence referendum anytime soon, because I think absolutely people across Scotland want the focus on this moment to be recovery, not referendums.
Okay. I mean, I think you would probably agree the SNP are quite likely to win again in May. We can debate how many seats
Well, it's
they might
interesting
get.
it's interesting, Tom. If you look at the opinion polling, the SNP are roughly where they were ahead of the 2016 Scottish elections. The Scottish Conservatives are actually, in some of the polls doing a bit better than we were at this time ahead of the 2016 elections. And of course, the SNP went into that election with a majority and came out of it having lost their majority because the Scottish Conservatives more than doubled their seats from 15 to 31. So absolutely everything's to play for in the run-up to the elections later on this year.
Well, thank you for correcting me. Of course, nothing is counted until every vote indeed is cast. So let's just, however, strategise, because I know you've been doing a lot of that and Downing Street is doing that now. Say that the Nats do get enough of a majority to push forward their plans in or outside of a coalition or a majority government in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon said she will pass a bill to enact a referendum this morning, part of her 11-point plan, not 9 or 10 points, but 11 points, we read. Do you agree that Boris Johnson should still refuse her demand for a referendum no matter what?
Well, you were absolutely right to say nothing's decided until the votes are cast and counted. We've not even started the proper campaign here in Scotland yet, so I'm not going to enter into any hypotheticals about what might or might not happen. But when you're speaking about an 11-point plan that the SNP have announced for independence, why don't we have an 11-point plan to protect jobs in Scotland? Why don't we have an 11-point plan to ensure businesses get the support they need across Scotland right now? Why don't we have an 11-point plan to rebuild our education system in Scotland, which after 14 years of the SNP being in power has plummeted down the international rankings? This is where the focus should be in Scotland right now, not fighting another independence referendum.
I understand, but I am asking about another independence referendum. Can you envisage any circumstances in which the Prime Minister should agree to hold a second independence referendum?
Well, I think we've got to look at the focus on being the elections coming up in May this year. This is an opportunity for people across Scotland to put the division that we've had in this country for the last number of years behind us, to focus on the recovery going forward. And there is an opportunity for people right across Scotland to look at the SNP's record in government, look at where they have let down the country, and instead of fighting for jobs or businesses fighting to stay open, the SNP want to fight another divisive referendum to separate Scotland from the rest of the country. I want to fight for these jobs, for these businesses, for communities, for better education, for a better health service. That's where the fight should be, and that's the fight I'm taking to the people of Scotland in May this year.
Totally understand, and that's your right. Also my right to ask you questions in the hope you might answer them with a little bit more directness, because it's a little funny. Every time you ask a British politician down in Westminster, a Tory politician or indeed a Labour politician, should there be a second referendum, they are always quick to say, no, there shouldn't. It was once in a generation. We've had it. You're not saying that. You're slightly opening the door to a second referendum.
No, Tom, absolutely. I don't believe there should be another referendum. I am proud of Scotland's place in the United Kingdom. I want to stand up to 2.6 million people across Scotland that voted to remain part of the United Kingdom just 6 years ago. That's where my focus is, and the Scottish Conservatives are the strongest party right across the country to take that fight to the SNP. What I do want to highlight is the fact that we shouldn't be having this divisive argument about independence again when there's so much we can and should be concentrated on right here in Scotland right now.
Okay, well, I'm glad we've cleared that one up. The independence or not is going to be on the ballot in the May elections. You've just said you're fighting to preserve the union and to concentrate on jobs and the recovery, not in independence referendums. It is an issue. Can I ask you, is Boris Johnson himself a benefit to you in your fight for the union, your fight for more seats at the Scottish Parliament in May?
Well, this election is more about individual personalities, and Boris Johnson's not on the ballot paper in May. I lead the Scottish Party north of the border, and I assembled the team, the policies, and the platform that we'll go to the public on in a few months' time. And I think it's a platform where we are showing there has been a great failure by the SNP over many issues that they're in charge of here in Scotland, and particularly during a pandemic, when people are still losing their lives in Scotland, when many people are still getting infected by this awful virus, when we're living with some of the toughest restrictions that we've had for the last year. That's where our focus should be, getting through this virus, ensuring the vaccine rollout is as strong as possible in Scotland, not entering into personality debates or, of course, what the SNP would like us to do, debates about separation.
Okay, but to be clear then, Boris Johnson's face will not be on your campaign leaflets in May.
Well, Boris Johnson's not standing for a seat in the Scottish Parliament. I am, and my team are standing for seats right across the 73 constituencies and regions here in Scotland.
Okay. Have you invited him to come up and campaign for you in those May elections?
The Prime Minister, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, will be up to Scotland. He's been in Scotland several times. Obviously, the pandemic has scaled back some of the interactions he can do up here in Scotland. But ultimately, this is a campaign I'm leading for the Scottish Conservatives, taking the fight to the SNP, because we see with all the other unionist parties, they don't have the strength right across the country to take that fight to the Nationalists.
Okay, well, that's clear. It also seems clear that, rightly or wrongly, Nicola Sturgeon has gained popularity at the UK government's expense during the pandemic and done that by appearing, and I say appearing, more cautious as well as more competent than the Prime Minister. That's what the opinion polls reflect. Whether it's true or not is not for me to say. Do you think the London government has made mistakes in not cracking down, for example, hardened off on these various waves of the pandemic and has dealt you a blow in terms of protecting the union?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to focus on appearances, because I think both governments have made mistakes, and I think if they reflect on their response to this pandemic at a UK level and in Scotland, both governments will have to accept that errors have been made along the way. We know we've had more deaths in care homes here in Scotland than in other parts of the United Kingdom. That's why the Scottish Conservatives urged for an inquiry into the deaths in care homes throughout this pandemic, because we don't want to make the same mistakes again later on in the COVID pandemic. But ultimately, I don't think many people could honestly pick big differences between how both the UK government and Scottish government have responded to the coronavirus pandemic during the last several months. And it does seem to be more about appearances rather than actual differences in the response.
You pointed out some mistakes that you believe Nicola Sturgeon has made, and obviously the vaccine rollout is progressing faster in England than Scotland as well. But you said both governments have made mistakes. What mistakes has Boris Johnson's government made?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has accepted mistakes have already been made in terms of care homes as well. In Scotland, we had the awful situation where people who had tested positive for COVID in hospital were then sent into a care home setting. But there have been errors made in Scotland, I think, in other parts of the United Kingdom, and I think that is accepted by the respective governments. And I wouldn't say this is unique to the United Kingdom either. We've seen governments across the world are facing really difficult challenges dealing with a virus that none of us knew about just over a year ago. So it's understandable that mistakes will have been made, but it comes back to your earlier point. It is more appearance rather than actual differences in terms of the response to COVID-19 that we're seeing in Scotland.
Okay, well, what is happening there with those appearances? Why do so many people in Scotland appear to think that Nicola Sturgeon is doing this better than Boris Johnson, if she isn't? What is going wrong with the presentation, maybe?
Well, I think here in Scotland that obviously the First Minister has a daily briefing that she speaks to people right down a camera lens on the BBC, so she's at the forefront of the communication of the Scottish Government's response here. But, as I say, you would find it very difficult to see real differences in terms of how the Scottish Government have handled COVID-19 compared to the UK Government.
Perhaps you're suggesting Boris Johnson should talk more regularly to have a daily briefing himself?
Well, obviously the UK government did have daily briefings. They stopped and then they restarted again. But I think the communication element of this is one area where the perception has proved to be, different compared to the reality on the ground.
Okay, let's talk about Nicola Sturgeon herself. She is in some political hot water at the moment over the Alex Salmond trial. He was, of course, acquitted of all accusations of sexual offences. You've called Nicola Sturgeon a liar in her dealings over the prosecution of Mr. Salmond. Why was that?
Well, it's now becoming very clear that Nicola Sturgeon has misled the Scottish Parliament in terms of when she first knew about these allegations against Alex Salmond. This is a First Minister who has a reputation on of being on top of the brief on every single detail, but we're now told she forgot about crucial meetings she had had regarding this awful situation. And I think if anyone had seen the First Minister on television earlier on today, she gets very touchy about this issue and the interrogation into what she knew, when she knew it, and how her government have handled this whole situation, which has obviously resulted in Alex Salmond getting almost £500,000 in legal expenses paid for by Scottish taxpayers and UK taxpayers.
If she has misled the Scottish Parliament, and you're adamant she has, that's a breach of the ministerial code, isn't it? So should she resign?
Yes, and 68% of people in Scotland believe that the First Minister should resign if she has lied to the Scottish Parliament. And I thought it was, unacceptable for the First Minister to not even respond to that question today. If she has been found guilty of lying to the Scottish Parliament, the public are very clear she cannot continue. And this comes down to a matter of trust. First of all, Tom, there's women at the heart of this who have been through a horrific ordeal, and their plight has been minimised throughout the remainder of this situation because of all the fighting going on between the Scottish Government and within the SNP. But we have to remember at the heart of this, women were involved, and we have to acknowledge the hurt that they went through. But ultimately, we have a First Minister and a former First Minister of Scotland with very conflicting views on what happened, and it comes down to trust in Nicola Sturgeon.
So just to be clear, are you calling for her to resign now because you are completely satisfied she has broken the ministerial code, or only to resign when the Scottish Parliament deems that officially so?
Well, of course, there's two separate entities to this. One, there's an inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of the complaints, and that's an inquiry of the Scottish Parliament that's made up of MSPs. But there is also a further inquiry into the potential breach of the ministerial code, which is being examined by an independent investigator. So we've got to wait to see what both these come out with. But I think the evidence we've seen so far points to a very clear breach of the ministerial code by the First Minister.
Do you think she was executing a vendetta against Alex Salmond? I mean, they were buddies for a very long time, weren't they? They then had a spectacular falling out, not least over who should lead the SNP and what should happen next with independence. And all of this, of course, at the cost of £500 to Scottish taxpayers, you pointed out. Was she acting on a vendetta?
You have to question the motives of the people involved with this, but Nicola Sturgeon has been at the heart of the SNP for decades now. She was the former First Minister Alex Salmond's closest ministerial colleague. She was the Deputy First Minister to Alex Salmond. The two of them championed the SNP and the separatist movement here in Scotland for so long. And of course, she has family connections, because not only is she the First Minister, but her husband, Mr Murrell, is the Chief Executive of the Scottish National Party. And we still have this debate between Nicola Sturgeon and her husband. Was this a Scottish Government matter, or was it a Scottish National Party matter? And that just shows how murky this whole situation is, and Scotland and the people of Scotland deserve the truth.
We may soon get to that. Let's wait and see. It does seem to think, in your belief, though, that Alex Salmond should never have been prosecuted. Is that right?
No, absolutely. When there are complaints made, these issues have to be dealt with seriously by the police and fully investigated. But we have to look at the procedures put in place by the Scottish Government. And we were looking earlier on this week about some of the procedures put in place to deal with bullying within the Scottish Government, which again, Nicola Sturgeon was heavily involved with as Deputy First Minister. Given her long record in government, she has been at the heart of the Scottish Government while these allegations were made, were investigated and were looked at, and that's why it's right that the inquiry are trying to get to the bottom of this. It shouldn't take a Scottish Parliament cross-party inquiry to get to the bottom of the truth between the current First Minister and the former First Minister, but it just shows how the Scottish Government have got themselves embroiled in such an awful situation.
Let's move on finally to Brexit. You voted for the UK to remain in the EU. Brexit is now done, of course. But in your view, has it been a good thing or a bad thing for the Union? Because Nicola Sturgeon hasn't half made some hay over it.
Well, she didn't have make hay over it, telling us how terrible it would be for a no-deal Brexit, and the UK government worked hard to get a deal which allowed us to leave the European Union on the 1st of January with a deal. And I assumed, given everything Nicola Sturgeon and everything the SNP had said about how bad leaving without a deal would be, that they would support the deal. But they didn't. They wanted to play politics with this all over again, and they voted against the deal. So I think we've got to look at the SNP's hypocrisy on this issue and many others. But in terms of Scotland's future now, out with the European Union, we have opportunities to trade right around the world, and I think the fact that we've got a deal is a good thing for businesses, for individuals and communities right across the United Kingdom.
Well, final question for me. Let's just talk about that deal in particular. You're well aware of it. You're well aware of the complaints of Scottish fishermen, both in terms of access to waters that they wanted, they're not getting, and also their product, whole lorry loads worth of langoustines, for example, rotting. Do you think the Brexit deal agreed by the Prime Minister on Christmas Eve let down Scottish fishermen?
Well, I absolutely accept there were concessions on both sides, from the EU side and the UK government side. But over the next 5 years, we'll have a 25% increase in the quotas available and the catch available for our fishermen here. And at the end of the 5.5 years, we have absolute control over who fishes what, where and when. But on the current issues, in terms of exports, I've been quite clear that the UK government and the Scottish government have got to sort this out. There are issues with exporting, with the forms, with the bureaucracy, and also here in Scotland there have been issues with the hubs at Larkhall that have led to long delays and produce being wasted. So I've been very open that I want the governments to work together to resolve this issue, because our fishing industry has a bright future here in Scotland and across the UK, and we've got to see it reaping those benefits by making sure the system works for our fishermen and those businesses that are integral to the whole process.
To be clear, Mr. Ross, the reasons why there are delays are mandated for in the agreement. It is all about extra paperwork. So could that agreement have been better for Scottish fishermen?
So absolutely, I think we've got to look at the paperwork and the bureaucracy. I've said that publicly in the meetings that I've had with fishing industry leaders here in Scotland as well. But we do have an issue at Larkhall where it's taking far too long for the sign-off of goods to then travel to the border and across into Europe. So we've looked at how much money has been spent by the Scottish Government. They obviously got £200 million to prepare for Brexit preparations. Not all of that money was spent, and I want to know why they were not prepared for the issues that we're currently facing Scottish fishermen as they try to get through the hub at Larkhall. So it's an issue for both governments.
Douglas Ross, good morning. It's Gloria here.
Hi, Gloria.
I was interested in what you were saying about you would rather Nicola Sturgeon produce a multi-point plan on things like jobs, education, health, rather than getting to an independence referendum. The trouble is that, and the Sunday Times has done extensive polling on this today, when Scottish people are asked whether they think they'd be worse off economically with an independent Scotland, they say yes, but they still want to be independent. Are you fighting on the right front here?
Well, I'm saying it's a matter of both the head and the heart, and I think that's where the fight has to be. But we can't ignore the fact that after 14 years of the SNP being in power in Scotland, that our educational standards have dropped, that the fact that the number of teachers employed in Scotland has dropped significantly since the SNP came to power in 2007. That has a huge impact on the subject choice of our young people. The fact that businesses here in Scotland are crying out for support from the Scottish Government. We know there are hundreds of millions of pounds available to the Scottish Government, but it's not getting out to businesses quickly enough. These are all issues that the Scottish Government, the SNP, have the power over at the moment, and they should be focused on using those powers to help people and communities, businesses, and protect jobs in Scotland, and they're simply not doing that.
And finally, Douglas Ross, the word woke, it seems to unsettle a lot of politicians. The Prime Minister got into a bit of a pickle when he was asked this week whether Joe Biden was woke. We asked Thomas Simons whether he was woke, and he didn't really want to go there. Are you woke, Douglas Ross?
No, I don't think so. But that's for others to decide. But my view is I'm not, no.
Why not?
Well, I just don't believe I'm a woke politician. But as I say, others may have a different view.
Douglas Ross, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and you've been very
Thank you.
generous with your time.